Dear colleagues, dear friends, good afternoon. Welcome to you all. I'm very pleased to convene you here today for this Security Council Arria Formula meeting on the protection of cultural heritage in armed conflicts. France is very proud to be organising this meeting with the United Arab Emirates, and the Chargé d'Affaires is on my right, but also with the co-sponsorship of Cyprus and Italy, two states that have been committed in this area for a long time now. The aim of this meeting is obviously to discuss the implementation of Resolution 2347. The Council adopted this in 2017, as well as the strategies and policies that we can implement to protect cultural heritage in armed conflicts. This meeting will also allow us to discuss the progress made and persistent challenges to give a greater role to culture beyond just cultural heritage in situations of armed conflict. I'll begin straight away by giving the floor to our opening briefers, Ms. Audrey Azoulay on my left. She's Director General of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. We have General Vincenzo Milanese. He is Commander of Carabinieri for the Protection of Cultural Heritage in Italy, and Mr. Omar Al-Tawel, UNESCO Site Coordinator for the Revive the Spirit of Mosul initiative. He will be taking the floor virtually from Iraq. I'll begin by giving the floor to Ms. Azoulay.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, just a few names to start. The Bridge of Mastar, the Buddhas of Bamiyan, the mausoleums of Timbuktu. When cultural heritage is targeted, this goes beyond monuments. It is what they represent that is targeted. Our diverse, complex societies where everyone can find a place, living together instead of fighting against each other. Protecting cultural heritage should therefore be an essential aspect of peacekeeping and international security. And I welcome today's meeting and welcome the fact that it reaffirms, in the light of recent years, the importance of this topic. I refer in particular to the adoption of Resolution 2347 by the Security Council in 2017. This was a landmark resolution as it expanded the scope for the protection of cultural heritage in conflict with a universal geographical scope for the very first time, which was not the case for previous resolutions. It supported UNESCO's historic call for making the protection of cultural heritage a priority in conflict. UNESCO plays a major role in building this normative architecture in which we see ourselves evolving today, with the Hague Convention as the foundation in 1954, and this is an architecture that continues to evolve. In 1970, the convention was adopted against the trafficking of cultural goods, and the convention of 1954 was then completed with a second protocol in 1999 with specific instruments and a better defined regime of accountability, something that remains a major priority. Today, I think it still requires updating, and that is why a new mechanism for following up on the status of cultural goods will be proposed in December to member states. It will address, in particular, the use of satellite images that we are already using since 2014 with UNITAR and UNOSAT in Iraq, for example, in Syria, in Yemen, in Nepal, and right now in Ukraine as well. Finally, as you know, UNESCO has been called upon to contribute to the implementation of the mandate of the International Criminal Court in the deliberate destruction of cultural heritage, which is now recognized as a war crime, with the first sentencing for this scene in 2016. And in 2017, we formalized cooperation between UNESCO and the Prosecutor's Office of the ICC. This normative aspect, which is essential, is something that we are building on the ground in Iraq and Yemen and Ukraine. These are three major operations that we are carrying out currently, among others, and I'd like to touch upon them in more detail. In Ukraine, together with our partners, we're verifying, collecting, and publishing continually for the benefit not only of Ukrainians but the international community information on damages dealt to cultural sites. We are already carrying out projects together with Ukrainians to restore or protect some of these sites. For example, in Kiev, when it comes to museums, 10 million US dollars have already been mobilized by UNESCO for this cultural effort in Ukraine, thanks to Japan, Spain, and others. But of course, our needs go well beyond this amount. Together with the president of Ukraine, we are developing a plan to support the cultural sector, which is an essential element for this country's future. UNESCO is also working in Ukraine in the context of the 1972 Convention on Cultural Heritage, and the Odessa Historical Center was recently added to the list of World Heritage Sites. It is now benefits from the highest possible level of legal protection. Likewise, the committee also added the Marib archaeological site in Yemen to the list. This is another crisis area where UNESCO has been working in a very targeted manner since 2018 with the support of the EU in particular. We've already restored more than 500 buildings and historical sites in Aden, Sana, Shiba, and Azavid, and we are about to expand these efforts to 8 new governorates, and by 2016 we also hope to create a large number of jobs in this area, because cultural heritage also implies training, it implies education, and it implies jobs. And finally, the spirit of reviving the spirit of Mosul, another project that we've been supporting through culture and education. This is a symbolic city that was profoundly destroyed by the Daesh occupation, and with major support from the UAE, we have entered the final phase of rebuilding religious monuments that are iconic in this city, namely the Al-Nuri Mosque, the Al-Aqba Minaret, and other churches such as and convents. The clock towers on these churches and buildings are ringing once again as a new symbol of life, and we're also restoring 124 historic buildings, also with major financial support from the European Union. Here, cultural heritage is already acting as a development driver with more than 5,000 jobs already created and some thousand young people trained through $300 million raised for this operation. We also have an internal UNESCO emergency fund for cultural heritage to support action on the ground. And in 2023, it supported targeted interventions, 31 interventions in 23 countries, and this is a valuable universal tool which must be further significantly strengthened if we wish to see ourselves responsive and effective in all the areas where we operate.
Ukraine, Yemen, Iraq, these 3 examples demonstrate our collective efforts from UNESCO, but with also the support of our partners, not only to implement the cultural conventions, but also to curb the escalation of violence during conflicts and to support peace. Efforts that are being carried out in several countries through the provision of information, particularly geographical coordinates of cultural sites, to both the peacekeeping forces and the belligerents. And in this regard, the adoption of MINUSMA's mandate in 2013 marked an important milestone. It was the first time that a peacekeeping mission's mandate identified the protection of cultural heritage as one of its purposes. Mr. President, I think it's a good opportunity to see how we can go further on this issue of the protection of cultural heritage in a situation of crisis, particularly in the implementation of the Resolution 2347. It is undoubtedly time to take stock of its implementation and to identify ways to complement it. First, we could suggest a mechanism for regular reporting reporting to the UN Security Council that could be established. A second area for improvement or for work or for reflection would be to further strengthen the fight against illicit trafficking, which was a major focus of the resolution. And I particularly would like to commend here our partnership with the Italian Carabinieri in this domain. There are still challenges, though, in sharing information on stolen cultural objects between the different countries due to differences in inventory methods, to the absence of a common standard and difficulty, therefore, for judicial systems to fully cooperate. The last matter I would like to address concerns the approach to the definition of culture to be protected, which is still maybe too narrowly confined to its limited meaning of tangible heritage, to monuments. Our joint action must better encompass the intangible heritage, but also the cultural diversity, the artists, the artistic scene, as the UNESCO conventions encourage us to do so. It's a commitment that UNESCO is already bearing and one in which we're ready to assume greater coordinating role. I would like to thank you to conclude, Mr. President, to thank the co-chairs, France and the UAE, and the co-sponsor, Italy and Cyprus, on this meeting on a key dimension, I believe, of maintaining international peace and security. Thank you. Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Director General. I think that we'll now see a short UNESCO video about Mosul and Yemen. So if we could roll that video, please.
Revive the Spirit of Mosul. It's an initiative that brings the life back to Mosul. Most of the landmarks of the city were majorly damaged. People start losing hope of getting back the city how it was before. But this initiative focused on the main landmarks of the city, the main places that means a lot to the people, like Al-Hadba Minaret. It's the symbol of Mosul. And also Al-Tahira Church and Al-Sa'ad Church. So reviving the spirit of Mosul, it's not only rebuilding the stone, it's giving the people hope. It's rebuilding of trust between people. There is Muslims and Christians working together in rebuilding the mosque and rebuilding the church. We like the diversity of Mosul. This is what giving colors to Mosul.
أسمع والله فرحة يعني فرحة لأنه أحس بالأمان أحس أنه رجعوا يعني شيء مفرح يعني.
المهندسة نهى عبد الله يحيى البقال، عمري 24 سنة، تخصصي هندسة معمارية، خريجة جامعة العلوم والتكنولوجيا في اليمن صنعاء. عرفت عن التدريب عن طريق صديقاتي انه المركز المعماري يقيم تدريب، بعدين بدأنا بالتدريب الميداني، نزلنا وشفنا مهندسين يشرفوا وشفنا كيف الأعمال تكون كيف تتنفذ. أول ما نزلت الميدان كان شعوري جدا بالفخر إني كمرأة يمنية واثقة من نفسي قادرة أنزل وأشرف سواء كان بين عمال أو أساطية معلمين، وقادرة أثبت لمجتمعي إن المرأة اليمنية قادرة تشتغل وتعمل أي شيء وهي واثقة من نفسها. مشروع إنقاذ بالنسبة لي يعتبر أمل جديد.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much to UNESCO for this film and for your presentation. I now hand the floor over to Vincenzo Molinesi, Commander of the Carabinieri for the Protection of Cultural Heritage in Italy. You have the floor, sir.
First slide, please. Okay. Good afternoon. First of all, allow me to thank you for this opportunity, particularly both to France and the United Emirates co-presidency, and the UNESCO, Cyprus, and Italy co-sponsor of this event. Next slide, please. The TPC carries out tasks concerning the safety and protection of cultural heritage through the prevention and repression of crimes relating to the protection of cultural properties and protected landscapes, such as, for example, theft of cultural property, trade in illegal excavated archaeological finds, illegal export, counterfeiting of works of art, illicit trade in rare books and archival documents, illegal construction in protected area. Thanks to the experience and skills acquired in 53 years of activity, the TPC Command is at the forefront of the international scene in the field of cultural heritage protection. Over the years, it has promoted and taken part in training activities in collaboration with other nations with a view to sharing. The TPC Command also provides to the Ministry of Culture the basis for recovering illegal exported artifacts through cultural diplomacy. Raising public awareness has always been considered essential by the TPC Command, since effective preservation of cultural heritage can only be achieved through the support and input of communities. With the historic signing of Memorandum of Understanding, which took place in Rome in 2016, Italy was the first country in the world to set up and make available to UNESCO in the Task Force Caschi Blu della Cultura, Blue Helmets of Culture, made up of qualified members of the Carabinieri TPC to interview following both armed conflicts and calamities or unpredictable events that affect the cultural heritage, both in Italy and abroad. After the headquarters in central Italy and Ischia, Task Force identified the place in which to secure the works of art, extracting them from churches, museums, public buildings, and private apartments at risk or further damage. Even those caused from atmospheric agents, helping in the coordination of their transport. Furthermore, the Caschi Blu della Cultura intervened on the occasion of the high water in Venice and in occasion of earthquake near Florence. It has also been employed abroad in countries such as Mexico, Albania, Lebanon, and Croatia, and has conducted training courses for other police force and the local ministries in Kosovo, Iraq, Ecuador, Mexico, Albania, Bolivia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Cuba, El Salvador, Iran, Libya, Palestine, Peru, and Qatar. The task force is made up of military personnel from the TPC Command, Carabinieri, and experts from the Ministry of Culture. Slide 3, please. Today I have the pleasure to show you the Criminal Reform Cultural Heritage Law in Italy. On the 21st January 2022, Italy ratified and implemented the Council of Europe Convention on Infringements Relating to Cultural Heritage, signed in Nicosia, Cyprus, on May 2017. The purpose of this important European Convention is to prevent and combat any criminal action against cultural heritage with the recognition of specific crime, strengthen the prevention and response of criminal justice, and promote national and international cooperation in the fight against crime related to cultural heritage. On March 2022, the new law entered into force in Italy with the new provisions on crimes against cultural heritage, which transposes and implements the indication of the Nicosia Convention through the introduction of new articles relating to crimes against cultural heritage. Title 8 bis in the Penal Code, which increases the power of intervention and investigative activities of the police forces, aggravating the penal measures, introducing new crimes and giving the possibility to conduct undercover operation. Next slide, please. This is the core business of our activity. Technological business is very important for us to protect the cultural heritage. The TPC command manages a powerful IT system, the Leonardo database, created to interface with the database of illicitly stolen cultural properties, the largest database in the world in the sector, containing information on activities, individuals, events for the purpose of identifying and prosecuting crimes against cultural heritage. More than 200,000 events and almost 7 million cultural objects have been archived, of which almost over 1 million are to be searched. The HITPC application allows any more to contribute to the fight against crimes against cultural heritage through the reporting of works of dubious origin and the creation of the object ID, through which every citizen has possibility to fill in a form on a work or an event, such as theft, to speed up the research and recovery of the objects to which they refer. The app has been developed for the latest generation of mobile device, and a new version is currently being finalized. Next slide, please. Regulation and SWOTs. This is very important. The growing use of telematic channels instead of the traditional ones for illicit trade or the export of cultural heritage requires continuous updating of IT system. The SWOTs, Stolen Works of Art Detection System project, currently being finalized, allows for the automatic collection of data from the web, deep web, social media, and the information entered by the operational components. The result of the control activity, and to compare all with the textual and photographic context of the works of art registered in the Leonardo database. And it is thanks to SWOTs that, as part of Police World Summit in Dubai, which was held from 7 to 9 March 2023, the Innovative Police Force Award was assigned to the Arma dei Carabinieri for SWOT's project. Next slide. Technological projects. But the Carabinieri Command for the Protection of Cultural Heritage is also engaged in various technological projects aimed at protecting and safeguarding the Italian cultural heritage. Among these, some experimental projects stand out, presented by the Ministry of Culture in June 2021, supported by the Italian Space Agency and the European Space Agency, which are based on the use of cutting-edge aerospace technologies for surveillance and the monitoring of cultural heritage through the use of technologies such as satellites, drones, EOT, sensor, EA, and 5G. In particular, the Pomerium project aims to safeguard the cultural and environmental heritage of historic center of Rome through the use of these technologies. Next slide. International operational project. Furthermore, the TPC is engaged in various international operation projects aimed at combating the illicit trafficking of cultural property. These include Pandora, in which the TPC participates as co-leader, EU CultNet, an informal network of experts on the international trafficking of cultural goods, and Counter ISIL Financial Group, a working group created to fight ISIL. All these operations aims to ensure greater security and protection of cultural heritage through the coordination and support of police forces at international level. Next slide, please. International training activities. On the occasion of events held in Italy and abroad, also at the request of international organizations such as UNESCO, OSCE, European Commission, International Red Cross, and others, this command intervened with its own representative in course, seminars, meetings, including 2 trainings organized by the Italian Latino American International Organization in Rome, a complex and articulate twinning activity in support of the Jordanian Royal Department for the Environment and Tourism, in Amman, the first pilot course on the protection of cultural heritage for military and police officials of OSCE countries, in Helsinki and Sofia, the participation in the Protect Heritage Property project organized by the European Commission to support the protection of cultural heritage in Lebanon, Beirut. The command also organized in Rome a training activity in favor of African Union countries and some study visit by delegation of the tourist police of Libya, Jordan, and Montenegro, and the course for the establishment and training of the Cascos Azules de la Cultura, a task force composed of federal police, firefighters, and technicians from the Argentina Ministry of Culture in Buenos Aires. Next one, please. Blue Helmets of Culture course in Mexico. This is our looking for the training. In this context, in collaboration with the Italo-Latin American International Organization, a training mission for Blue Helmets of Culture was organized for 7 Latin American countries: Mexico, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Guatemala, Dominican Republic, and Costa Rica, which will take place in Mexico City from 5 to 17 June 2023. With the collaboration of the Mexican Instituto Nacional de Antropología and Historia, the participants will be selected from a call by the HILA, and they will receive the training from Italian, TPC, and Ministry of Culture, an Argentinian expert qualified as Blue Helmets of Culture, new qualified of Blue Helmets of Culture. Next one, please. Operational activity 2022. As a term of reference only, in 2022, almost 10,000 antiquarian, archival, and books assets have been recovered by TPC. More than 7,000 archaeological finds and about 53,000 paleontological finds, and beyond, over 1,000 fakes were seized. Here is the cover of the 2022 TPC operational activity report published on the last April and downloadable from the Ministry of Culture and Carabinieri website that you can find in this slide. The last one, please. Today's occasion is particularly welcome to me because we are sharing ideas, thoughts, identity, and values that unite us. For these common values, we all affirm that the protection of cultural heritage is the basis of civilization and a testament to human identity, history, and property. For this reason, we are all committed to raising public awareness on the importance of preserving culture for future generations, sharing and promoting best practice worldwide, because culture is a global public benefit. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you very much, General Molinese. I'm now going to give the floor to Mr. Omar Al-Tawel. He will be taking the floor by video from Iraq.
Vous avez la parole, Monsieur Altawel.
You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I find this as a very important opportunity for me to be present here with the members of the Security Council to speak about my city, Mosul, and to speak about the destruction of its history and heritage. Mosul is a city in northern Iraq. It is considered to be one of the most ancient cities in the world. For thousands of years, Mosul was a crossing point. It was a bridge that connects north to south and east to west, given its strategic location. Mosul was a place and an abode for people from various backgrounds, ethnicities, races, beliefs, and religions. The distinct history of Mosul was written on the stones of this ancient city, and its museum documents the Arab and the Assyrian history, as well as the myriad number of mosques and shrines. The books that are sold on the streets of Mosul are an incarnation of the ideas that were melt in the cubicule of Mosul. However, this very distinct history made it a target to the organization of ISIS, as it was controlled by ISIS and it was used as the center of its caliphate. Mosul has gone through very difficult 3 years until it managed to break free of the shackles of violent extremism. During those years, Mosul witnessed a number of battles, and its population were displaced. The terrorist crimes that were perpetrated in our city, including the destruction of the archaeological sites, are no less horrendous than the killing of people and the damage of and the destruction of landscape, because it is an obliteration of our past and an effacement of our identity. I personally, when I was displaced outside of my city during the war, I felt pain, especially when I saw on the news the intimidation and the cruelty, including the destruction of Nabi Yunus shrine in 2014. And this is one of the most famous landmarks in Iraq, and it is a holy site for Muslims, Christians, and Jews, as it was the last abode of Nabi Yunus, the prophet Jonah. Also, I was hurt when I heard about the looting of museums and archaeological sites and the smuggling thereof by terrorists, as well as destroying Al-Nuri mosque and its convex minaret, as well as Al-Sa'a church and Al-Tahira church. I was dreaming of going back to my city. I was dreaming of liberating my city and of reviving its spirit. Fortunately, today I'm working on the revival of the Spirit of Mosul initiative, which was launched in 2018 in collaboration with UNESCO to revive one of the most ancient cities of Iraq. This exceeds the physical reconstruction. In fact, this is a method whereby people can engage as drivers and agents of change, and it is an opportunity to build the capacity of young people using international experience. This initiative also, which was supported by UAE, has gave impetus to progress in the city, and it restored the social cohesion in Mosul, which is diversified. Also, it has restored the societal participation by all people. Today, we see Christians and Muslims in Mosul who work together to reconstruct mosques and churches. We see all the sects, the Shabak, the Arabs, the Kurds, the Yazidis, all religions, even women. They are currently engaging actively in this endeavor. And as you have seen in the video that was presented, we are not only there to build stone, but we are also building trust and peace. And this is indeed are the values of the United Nations. Protection of heritage is very important and necessary to build the resilience of people during a conflict, but also it is more important for recovery and for reconciliation. In addition to the foregoing, adopting a holistic approach to protect cultural heritage and to rehabilitate the destroyed culture could be key in reconciliation. In fact, the restoration of the archaeological Mosul heritage will build bridges between young generations and their history, and this will reconnect the society to its history and to peaceful coexistence and tolerance. And in this regard, I would like to quote the director of UNESCO as when she said, if you are to be able to freely build your identity and to draw on different cultural resources, these are the main foundations for peaceful development and sustainable development. In Mosul there are abundance of valuable sites in Mosul, and some of them have been partially or totally destroyed. Thus, they have to be rehabilitated. We have gone through through horrendous experiences, and today we have the energy and the desire necessary to overcome those dark times. And working with UNESCO during the last couple of years was a source of hope to us and energy to build better future by restoring the past, which educates us on our diversified identity. Thank you.
Je remercie beaucoup pour son témoignage.
I very much thank Mr. Altawil for his briefing straight from Mosul, Iraq. This will allow to make our discussion more tangible and better illustrated. It is now time to hold an exchange between member states, and I will then perhaps begin.
Thank you once again for being here today. I'd like to thank our briefers, the Director General of UNESCO, Commander Molinese, General Milanese, and Mr. Omar Al-Tawil. I thank them for their participation. And I would like to take advantage of the fact that the Director General of UNESCO is here to express support to the role of UNESCO and the fact that supporting culture, etc., is at the heart of the United Nations mandate. It also speaks to the importance of cultural diversity. Today, UNESCO is here to talk to us about the protection of cultural heritage, which is at the heart of the mandate of that organisation. France is proud to be organising this meeting with Italy, as I mentioned earlier, and with the UAE, and also with Cyprus. The statements that we've just heard are very clear. Armed conflict and terrorism that is affecting all continents, millions of people, has not spared cultural heritage, and often cultural heritage is targeted by terrorist movements and wars and directly targeted by parties to a conflict. The bombing of the Mariupol theatre by the Russian armed forces is unfortunately a sad example of this. The decision to include Odessa on the list of cultural heritage in danger, the UNESCO's list, underscores the danger of the war of aggression waged by Russia in Ukraine since March 2022. More than 500 sites have been damaged by the combat. According to UNESCO, we've seen the looting of 1,000-year-old sites in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and unfortunately many other conflict areas. The destruction of heritage fuels violence, hatred, revenge between peoples, and it weakens the very foundations of peace. It's no coincidence, and this was mentioned by the Director General, that the UNESCO First Cultural Convention, less than 10 years after the end of the Second World War, was committed to protecting cultural heritage in situations of armed conflict. The trafficking of looted cultural goods is often used to finance terrorist networks. This trafficking contributes to perpetuating and intensifying conflicts, and we therefore believe it's essential to bring an end to this. In this regard, I would like to pay tribute to the absolutely remarkable work carried out in this area by the UNODC, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. France is proud to have, in 2017, brought forward with Italy Resolution 2347 in the Security Council. This is the first resolution dedicated exclusively to protecting cultural heritage and its role for peace and security. It addresses the issue of the endangering of cultural heritage in armed conflicts, be this at the hands of listed terrorist groups or sanctioned terrorist groups or other armed groups. There are major challenges. We must continue to step up our implementation of this resolution, and we don't hear enough about it in the Security Council. I recognise that. And also our commitment to protect cultural heritage, both with member states and to civil society, but also with international organisations, including UNESCO, obviously. France, in this regard, welcomes the inclusion of Odessa on the 2nd of January, and Marib in Yemen, and the Tripoli International Fair on the list of international heritage in danger. These sites were damaged by war, can therefore be protected by the strictest international laws and will benefit from the conservation policies in place thanks to UNESCO. To conclude, I would also like to pay tribute to the work of the International Alliance for the Protection of Heritage in Conflict Areas, ALIF, that France and the United Arab Emirates founded in 2017. Since its establishment, it has become an important stakeholder in protecting cultural heritage in countries at war. We've been able to finance more than 180 projects in 30 countries across 4 continents. The presentation just been given by Mr. Altawel on reviving the spirit of Mosul also reminds us of the fact that heritage plays an important role in restoring peace. Thank you very much to you all. I'd now like to give the floor to the Chargé d'Affaires of the UAE. You have the floor.
أصحاب السعادة الحضور الكريم.
Excellencies and colleagues, I thank the briefers for their valuable information. At the outset, I would like to stress that cultural heritage embodies people's identity and history. It connects us to the past and lays the ground and the foundations to build a more peaceful and inclusive future. Therefore, the destruction, distortion, or looting of cultural heritage in armed conflict situations has serious repercussions that threaten building and sustaining peace. That's why the Security Council adopted its historic Resolution 2347, which explicitly recognizes that the unlawful destruction of cultural heritage and the attempts to deny historical roots and cultural diversity in this context can fuel and exacerbate conflicts and hinder national reconciliation. Resolution 2347 also affirmed that intentional and deliberate unlawful attacks against cultural heritage sites may constitute in certain circumstances a crime of war. The UAE has played an active role in sponsoring programs that preserve cultural heritage as a part of its integrated strategy to spread the values of tolerance and diversity and to build a better future for people. The UAE has hosted, in partnership with France in 2016, the International Conference for the Protection of Endangered Cultural Heritage, which culminated in the Abu Dhabi Declaration, where 40 states and international organizations committed to supporting the establishment of safe havens for cultural heritage under threat in conflicts. A year later, as mentioned by the representative of France, and recognizing that sufficient funding is a necessary component in the protection of cultural heritage, my country, in cooperation with France, has launched the International Coalition Fund for the Protection of Heritage in Conflict Areas, ALIF, which has so far supported initiatives to protect cultural heritage worth of $50 million in more than 30 countries. As we heard today, and after the terrorist group Daesh destroyed many archaeological sites in Iraq, to eliminate all manifestations of peaceful coexistence intellectually and physically, the Revive the Spirit of Mosul project was launched to reconstruct this ancient city and restore its unity, heritage, culture, and architecture that date back to thousands of years in Mosul demonstrate that peaceful coexistence between different groups is not only possible, but it is rooted in our human history. Our meeting today reviews the progress made in the implementation of Resolution 2347 after 6 years of adopting the same, where dynamics of armed conflicts globally have experienced several changes, making it imperative on us to reassess our methods of protecting cultural heritage. Cultural heritage is of fundamental importance, starting with building peaceful societies to the need to protect it during conflicts. Also, we must prevent its exploitation by terrorist groups as a tool for financing or spreading intolerance and hatred. We must also work towards its rehabilitation to promote reconciliation amongst peoples. We are of the view that focusing on restoration and rehabilitation of cultural heritage towards building and sustaining peace is worthy of our attention. Notwithstanding the fact that the Security Council recognizes the impact of destroying cultural heritage on the security, stability, and development of affected states, we still need to deepen our understanding of the methods whereby we can harness this cultural heritage to help those states recover. It is critical to engage local communities in protecting cultural heritage. And we have to raise the awareness of its role and the cultural, scientific, and economic enrichment of nations. Meanwhile, we must focus on programs that make dialogue and intellectual exchange between different cultures a tool to understand others, to accept them, and to respect them. The reconstruction and rehabilitation of cultural heritage will have significant impact on promoting human values and encouraging people to work to rebuild their societies. The reconstruction of churches and mosques destroyed by Daesh is critical for embodying peaceful coexistence on the ground. In conclusion, we look forward to continuing the exchange of ideas on the methods whereby we can conserve and preserve cultural heritage and prevent its destruction or exploitation by terrorist or armed groups. Cultural heritage does not only contribute to maintaining peace and security, but it also provides an entry point to cherish and respect the values of tolerance and coexistence, which represent a framework for our common humanity. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Mohamed.
Thank you very much, Mohamed. I now give the floor to Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Switzerland thanks the United Arab Emirates, France, Cyprus, and Italy and for the organising this meeting and the briefers for their briefings. All peoples are united by common bonds, and their cultures are pieced together in a shared heritage, in a delicate mosaic that can be shattered at any time. Cultural heritage is the expression of our humanity and the ability to live together. It must be protected in all its forms, including by those who, the opposing sides in war. Security Council Resolution 2347 condemns the illegal destruction of cultural heritage and establishes a link with peace and security. Attacks on cultural heritage may constitute a violation of international humanitarian law, which grants specific protection to cultural property, but also human rights law. Switzerland stresses the importance of respecting international law. We'd like to mention the important role played by the International Criminal Court, which, pursuant to the Rome Statute, has jurisdiction over crimes committed against or to the detriment of cultural heritage. UNESCO and the International Centre for the Study of the Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property are doing essential work for heritage and the protection of heritage. We support their efforts. UNESCO's initiative Revive the Spirit of Mosul and its commitment in Beirut and Ukraine are just the latest examples of this. Switzerland is convinced that UNESCO has an important role to play as a coordinator and a guarantor of the fundamental principles that guide cultural conventions. Switzerland calls on states to ratify all UNESCO cultural conventions, including the 1954 Hague Convention and its protocols. Switzerland also supports the Geneva-based International Alliance for the Protection of Heritage in Conflict Areas, ALIF, which is agile and responsive. Switzerland has been committed in this area for many years. It has adopted a strategy for the protection of cultural heritage in danger. It supports the safeguarding and reconstruction of heritage, as is the case in Yemen, Afghanistan, Mali, and Ukraine. Switzerland was actually the first country to introduce legislation that allowed for the hosting of endangered foreign cultural property by providing a safe haven for it. Cultural resources can strengthen the resilience of populations in conflict situations. The rehabilitation of cultural sites, the repatriation of property, and the revitalization of cultural practices contribute to the preservation of collective memory and social reconciliation. Mr. President, in armed conflicts, the focus is on security and stability, but it is essential to integrate heritage into peace-building, humanitarian assistance programs, disaster risk reduction, and climate action programs. Culture cannot wait, because heritage, the anchor of our identities, our values, and our hopes, is rebuilt with even more effort than bridges, roads, and pipelines. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Switzerland, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Commends France, the United Arab Emirates, Cyprus, and Italy for holding this Arria Formula meeting on such an important subject. We thank also the Director General of UNESCO, Ms. Audrey Azoulay, and as well as Mr. Molineri and Mr. Altawid for their remarks. The protection of human life, particularly of the innocent and the most vulnerable, is the utmost priority in context of armed conflicts. Yet, all human beings are not single individual cells with no sense of belonging to a particular community. They are all part of a wider social fabric formed by common practices, habits, and customs that forges their collective identity and therefore their culture. Brazil supports all actions undertaken by governments and international organizations aiming at safeguarding and preserving cultural heritage in peril and actions for the protection of cultural goods in armed conflicts. The cultural heritage of a people is part of a collective identity and of personal integrity of local populations. Promoting cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, is essential to the respect of human rights, in particular, cultural rights. I would like to highlight four main messages on the protection of cultural heritage in armed conflicts. First, the protection of cultural objects is part of international humanitarian law. Protocol 1, additional to Geneva Conventions, prohibits acts of hostility directed against the historic monuments, works of art, or places of worship, which constitute the cultural and spiritual heritage of peoples. We recall that attacks against historic monuments and buildings dedicated to religion, education, and art may be considered war crimes, subject to both domestic and international criminal accountability. We also recall the importance of the safeguarding measures established by the Convention of the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflicts of 1954. Second, we must fight the illicit trafficking of cultural property, especially when it's a source for financing terrorism and transnational organized crime. 6 years ago, the Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2347 on the destruction and trafficking of cultural heritage by terrorist groups and in situations of armed conflict. The Council condemned engagement in direct or indirect trade of cultural goods with terrorist groups as it could constitute financial support for critics, people designated by the Sanctions Committee 1267. Third, Brazil calls for the return and restitution of cultural property, including illegally exported property to countries of origin. We are pleased that this important issue was considered at Mundicult. We also underscore that the UNESCO 1970 Convention recognizes that illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property is one of the main causes of the impoverishment of cultural heritage of countries of origin. We reiterate the invitation extended to all states to join UNIDROIT Convention of 1995 on stolen and illegally exported cultural objects, thereby strengthening the prospects of repatriation of cultural assets. Brazil expresses its support and underscores the significant value of UNESCO's work in developing initiatives to protect cultural and historical heritage. Furthermore, Brazil encourages efforts to invigorate the debate in this subject, in the subsidiary body, and in the Committee for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflicts. Returning a restitution of cultural property is essential to promote dialogue, reconciliation, and peaceful coexistence between and within communities in post-conflict situations. Mr. President, finally, my delegation believes we should promote international cooperation for the preservation of cultural goods in their place of origin. And this is essential to protect the cultural identity of local populations and to allow them to exercise fully their cultural rights. International cooperation may include capacity building, sharing of best practices, and financial contributions to support preventive and emergency operations. Thank you. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Brazil. I now give the floor to the ambassador of Japan, Kimura.
Yeah, Nicolas.
Thank you, Nicolas.
Convening this important meeting today, I also thank the briefers. As enshrined in the 1954 Hague Convention, any damage to cultural property, irrespective of the people it belongs to, is a damage to the cultural heritage of all humanity. This is a pressing concern since cultural heritage is neither replaceable nor completely repairable. This clearly illustrates the reason why we have to stand united in unequivocally opposing any unlawful destruction of cultural heritage, especially during armed conflicts. I would like to stress that cultural heritage is a representation of rich and unique identity and history, not only for the nation, but also of whole mankind. Hence, holds intrinsic value that we all should cherish. It is therefore deeply regrettable that cultural heritage is still facing threats of conflict around the world, not least in Syria, Ukraine, and Yemen. Japan calls on all parties to conflicts to respect all relevant international instruments, including the Security Council Resolution 2347 and the UNESCO 1954 Hague Convention and its two protocols, and join in our efforts to protect and preserve the cultural heritage under threat. Japan also calls upon member states who have not yet done so to accede to the 1954 Hague Convention and its two protocols. Japan has been deeply committed to the international efforts for the protection and preservation of cultural properties and heritage, and has been supporting activities to restore and safeguard cultural properties around the globe. For example, to date, the government of Japan has provided more than $4.5 million to assist the protection of cultural heritage in Ukraine. Also in Syria, Japan has been providing assistance to enhance the capacity of archaeologists and communities for the sake of preserving cultural heritage. Furthermore, protection and restoration of cultural heritage damaged by armed conflict is a critical component of peace building. Recovering the destroyed cultural heritage is a sincere desire of the people of the country. given that these have been an integral part of their lives and identity, and cooperation is needed to bring about their recovery. Keeping that in mind, Japan helped Cambodia, in coordination with international partners, to preserve and restore Angkor monuments, a symbol and national pride of Cambodian people. It is considered as one of the successful cases of safeguarding cultural heritage in the post-conflict setting. And in this case, Japan attached great importance to supporting Cambodian people to restore their own cultural heritage. Culture and people are deeply connected. That protecting culture requires investment in people. Mr. Chair, a series of reports of the damages incurred by Russia's attack on Ukrainian cultural properties is deeply concerning. We pay tribute to UNESCO for extending continuous support to the Ukrainian authorities in protecting its cultural heritage properties across Ukraine. Along with the international community, Japan condemns Russia's aggression in the strongest terms. Russia must immediately cease its war of aggression and comply with its obligations to refrain from any act of hostility directed against cultural property according to Article 4 of the 1954 Hague Convention. To conclude, Japan reiterates its commitment to protect cultural heritage and contribute to sustaining peace through such efforts, together with member states and the United Nations, starting with UNESCO. I thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Kimiro. I now give the floor to Gabon.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. President. I congratulate you and the co-sponsor for convening this debate on the protection of cultural heritage in armed conflict, the impact of which on the resilience of populations, reconciliation, and countries' reconstruction in general no longer needs to be demonstrated. I welcome the participation in this meeting of the Director General of UNESCO, Ms. Audrey Azoulay. Her contribution, which we have listened to with great interest, is greatly enriching our discussions. I also welcome the presence here of the Commander of the Carabinieri for the Protection of Cultural Heritage, General Vincenzo Molinesi, as well as that of Mr. Omar Altawiya. Mr. President, beyond human tragedy, armed conflicts have, as we all know, a devastating impact on the world's cultural and historical heritage. Archaeological sites, museums, religious buildings, and iconic monuments are often targeted in conflict zones. Attacks on these sites have increased in recent years, as has the looting and theft of works of art and antiquities, erasing centuries of history and cultural identity in an instant. We were all shocked by the images of Timbuktu, Palmyra, Bamiyan, and Mosul, which show the extreme violence that cultural heritage can be subjected to. The conflict in Ukraine is unfortunately no exception. The latest estimate from UNESCO from April 26, 2023, identifies nearly 250 sites that have been damaged since the beginning of the conflict. The destruction of cultural heritage affects not only the countries where that heritage is located, but all the nations of the world. It is a loss for humanity. Yes, indeed, a great loss for the history of humanity, because cultural heritage is a global good and an integral part of our common heritage. Resolution 2347, adopted in March 2017 unanimously by the members of the Security Council, provides the member states of the United Nations with an instrument that recognizes the importance of protecting cultural heritage for international peace and security. The deterioration, destruction, and deliberate looting of cultural property, as well as its trafficking, have thus gone from horrifying tactics of war to violations of the rules of war of particular gravity in that they undermine the identity of peoples. In the same vein, the adoption in February 2022 by the Executive Council of the African Union of a model law meant to help member states develop and strengthen their current national legislation on the protection of cultural property and heritage contributes to strengthening the international legal framework on the protection of culture. Mr. President, Today, armed groups, militias, terrorists, and individuals who have often organized looting in conflict zones in order to finance their activities must be prosecuted and held to account. The conviction on September 27, 2016 of Ahmad Al-Mahdi by the International Criminal Court for war crimes for having intentionally directed attacks against 10 of the most important and best-known monuments of Timbuktu, a city that is inscribed on UNESCO's World Heritage List since 1988, is thus an important element in mounting the international community's response. We must also encourage international cooperation, not only when it comes to investigations and exchange of data and information, but also when it comes to the restitution of stolen cultural property. Here, I would like to salute the commitment and the leadership role played by UNESCO in this area. Finally, this cultural dimension must be better taken into account in the mandates of peacekeeping operations. Indeed, it is important to act upstream by ensuring the preservation of our cultural heritage in times of armed conflict in order to facilitate intercultural dialogue and reconciliation during the reconstruction phase. To conclude, Mr. President, we cannot grasp history without our cultural history. Preserving it and protecting it in times of peace, but above all in times of war, is the responsibility of each and every state and individual throughout the world. As guardians of the collective memory and diversity of cultures, we have a duty to safeguard and to transmit to future generations our cultural heritage, the precious legacy of past civilizations. I thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
I thank the representative of Gabon and now give the floor to the representative of China Gang.
Mr. President, China welcomes the convening of this Arria meeting by France, the UAE, Italy, and Cyprus, and thanks Director General Azoulay, General Molinese, and Mr. Tawil for their briefing. I'd also like to take the opportunity to appreciate UNESCO for their long-term work, international cooperation to promote this area, for their contributions. Mr. President, cultural heritage, which perpetuates the spirit of nations and transmits national civilizations, is a precious treasure of humanity. During the colonial era, major powers plundered and destroyed cultural heritage, causing damage that has not been recovered to date. In modern times, armed conflicts have further wreaked havoc on cultural heritage. One doesn't have to look far for it. The Iraqi National Museum, which contained countless precious cultural relics, were tragically looted during the Iraqi war in 2003. And many cultural sites in Mosul and Palmyra were reduced to rubble by the Daesh terrorist group between 2014 and 2017. China condemns all acts of destruction of cultural heritage in armed conflicts and calls on the international community to unite and work together to stop such acts. I'd like to make the following 4 points. First, strictly observe international law. In order to protect cultural heritage in conflict situations, the international community has formulated a number of international conventions, and the Security Council has specifically adopted Resolution 2347. These legal instruments should be effectively observed and implemented. All parties to a conflict should take practical measures to save cultural heritage from damage caused by war. The international community should, in accordance with the wishes of countries in conflict areas, help them improve their domestic legislation, establish early warning mechanisms, strengthen law enforcement capacity, and improve the level of protection and restoration of cultural heritage. Second, we must try to resolve the confrontations and conflicts. This is the fundamental solution to protect the cultural heritage in conflict areas. We must insist on resolving disputes through dialogue and other political means, increase our good office and mediation efforts to resolve conflicts, promote peace and reconciliation, eliminate hatred and hostility. International cooperation in combating terrorism should be strengthened, and joint efforts to be made to combat terrorist acts and restore peace and stability in the countries and regions concerned. Third, strengthen civilizational exchanges. The civilization gap is an important reason for the destruction of cultural heritage. An exchange and mutual appreciation is an effective way to protect it. President Xi Jinping has proposed a global civilization initiative advocating respect for the diversity of world civilization and strengthening international humanistic exchanges. We should promote civilization exchanges to transcend civilizational gap, mutual appreciation for civilization to transcend civilizational conflicts, and tolerance of civilization to transcend civilizational superiority, and respect to cherish all the achievements of human civilization and all the heritage of human culture. Fourth, we should strive best to push for the return of cultural heritage. This is a broad consensus of the international community and a fundamental cultural right that people of a country of origin of cultural property cannot be deprived of. All countries should, in accordance with the relevant international legal framework and principles, jointly combat the smuggling, trafficking of cultural relics, and promote the return and restitution of cultural property. China insists on its right to recover illegally exported cultural relics, and will continue, in accordance with relevant international conventions and Chinese legal provisions, to recover the Chinese cultural relics lost overseas illegally. Mr. President, as a major cultural heritage country, China has actively participated in the work of the International Alliance for Protection of Heritage in Conflict Areas, ALIPH, and in April this year promoted the establishment of Alliance for Cultural Heritage in Asia and established the dedicated fund. China will continue to work together with other countries to jointly safeguard the cultural treasures and common memories of all humankind. Thank you, President.
Thank you very much, Ging. I now give the floor to Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mozambique wishes to thank France and the United Arab Emirates for their initiative of organizing this Arria Formula meeting on the protection of cultural heritage in armed conflicts. We also thank the briefers for their comprehensive insight on the topic. Mr. Chair, the magnitude of damage on cultural heritage and cultural properties around the world poses a serious danger on preservation of history of human civilization. The combinations of factors between man-made and by nature have shared impact on the degradation and destruction of cultural heritage. Indeed, cultural heritage protection, particularly in armed conflict situations, is of urgent action. In this regard, we appreciate this important reminding initiative today. We believe that this is a valuable contribution to the efforts to prevent unlawful destruction of cultural heritage. Unfortunately, in recent decades, this has been a sad reality. We have lost very important properties of world heritage. Today, some of them are identified being in danger. If current trends are not reverted in the near future, Asia alone may lose about 40% of its cultural heritage, followed by Africa with 30% of property in danger. We believe that coordination and cooperation between states and stakeholders are key for further addressing actions carried out by armed groups to cultural heritage. Mr. Chair, the vandalization and destructions of historical heritage of humanity by terrorist groups is an issue of great concern. Therefore, we commend the involvement of international community in the search of ways to address the current growing tendency. The resolution 2347 clearly indicates that protection of heritage is an integral part of sustainable strategies to build peace and security. Moreover, there is a need to ensure the implementations of 1954 Hague Convention for Protection of Cultural Property in the event of conflict, as well as its two protocols on this matter. Mr. Chair, let me make some additional points which I consider of relevance to this debate. First, we need to raise our level of awareness and the responsibility by promoting educational programs within communities about the values, importance, and the symbolism of historical cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible. We believe that awareness will contribute to reinforce local community responsibility to protect our common good. Second, impunity for the heritage destruction must end. We need to develop a broader local law enforcement and judicial cooperation for prevention and counter trafficking in cultural properties, including imposing sanctions. Third, to strengthen cooperation on the protection of cultural properties from looting and vandalization and of recovering stolen items. In this regard, we are of the view that coordination among national institutions is of utmost importance to improve management policies. Mr. Chair, let me conclude by reiterating my delegation's support in revigorating preventive actions to avoid the loss of more cultural heritage properties as they are our own good. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Mozambique, and I now give the floor to the United Kingdom. Fergus.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thanks very much to the permanent missions of France and the UAE, also Cyprus and Italy, for organising this debate. And thank you to France and the UAE for your work in establishing and managing the International Alliance for the Protection of Heritage in Conflict Areas, which we think is a very good initiative. When our cultural heritage is damaged or destroyed, as many others have said, in conflict, that damages society and creates longer-term risks for stability. That's why we have created the UK's International Cultural Heritage Protection Programme. It helps to build capacity to foster, safeguard and promote cultural heritage at risk from conflict and climate change. From the period 2016 to 2021, over 45,000 people across the Middle East and North Africa participated in the Cultural Protection Fund, and our research has responded to numerous urgent threats to cultural heritage from natural disasters and climate change. The United Kingdom continues to be committed to supporting these efforts with a further £30 million three-year project launched last year, 2022. This is important because the risks to cultural heritage remain grave and cultural destruction continues to be used as a weapon of war. We all know the story in Timbuktu, which many colleagues have recalled, where 14 of 16 mausoleums of saints on the UNESCO World Heritage List were destroyed by extremist groups in 2012. We know the story of Daesh's destruction of cultural heritage, particularly Yazidi culture in Iraq. Today, UNESCO has so far verified damage to a staggering 253 cultural sites as a result of Russian aggression in Ukraine, including the bombing of the Mariupol theatre, for example. Russia's actions in Ukraine put it in breach of its commitments under the 1954, 1970 and 1972 UNESCO conventions. This is just one of the many terrible consequences of Russia's aggression for the people of Ukraine, and we welcome and support Ukraine's ongoing efforts to protect and preserve their cultural heritage. Perpetrators of crimes against cultural property must be held accountable to appropriate legal instruments, including the Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict of 1954. We must also look to support in the provision of technical assistance to safeguard these heritage sites. We welcome the efforts of UNESCO, working closely with member states and international organisations in the protection of culture in armed conflicts. And the Security Council has an important role too. The adoption of Resolution 2347 in 2017 underscored very clearly the importance of cultural heritage and its role in the maintenance of international peace and security. We continue to encourage all members to make efforts to support the implementation of this important resolution. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Fergus. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Albania, who is relatively familiar with these issues. Thank you, Nicola. You're right.
To welcome the presence of Director General of UNESCO, Ms. Adria Zulay, and pay tribute to her efforts and the work of UNESCO in general for the preservation of cultural heritage in every aspect and respect. So thank you for being with us today, Adria. I also welcome General Molinese and Mr. Altawil to this meeting and thank them for their valuable insights. We commend France and UAE, as well as Cyprus and Italy, for this timely opportunity to reflect on the importance of safeguarding cultural heritage and for taking stock on the progress made in the implementation of the landmark Resolution 2347. As some of us may recall, last year, only a few months after the start of the war of aggression in Ukraine, together with Poland, we organized an Arria meeting to raise awareness of the urgent need to preserve the cultural heritage in Ukraine in the context of the ongoing war of aggression. At any time, cultural heritage provides a sense of identity and belonging to individuals, communities, and peoples, to any one of us. It connects people and their past and provides a foundation for their present and future. In conflict settings, preserving cultural heritage helps maintain a sense of identity and strengthens resilience. Unfortunately, as we have seen in so many times, in times of war, cultural heritage is often viewed as a tragic casualty perpetrated by state and non-state actors. Explosive blasts break through sandbags guarding the walls of historic buildings and shatter through museum crates. Worse, many times culture sites are the directly intended targets used as a weapon of war, and we have witnessed this in Georgia, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, as mentioned by Ms. Azulay. And if we ever wanted any more recent notorious examples, more than 25 impacts have been registered in Ukraine on archaeological sites, art centers, monuments, memorials, museums, archives, and places of worship. By targeting cultural heritage, those who intend to harm civilians adopt the pervasive view that in such a way they will undermine identity and erase the physical evidence of historic presence. But this is not all. With increased mobility throughout the world, cultural heritage has gradually become an important source of economic and development and tourism. More and more cultural sites and artifacts generate revenue and employment opportunities for local communities. I call it the UNESCO effect. Destroying cultural heritage can therefore have a significant detrimental economic impact as well. Whenever cultural heritage is threatened or deliberately destroyed, we do not just lose one ancient cultural artifact or site in a faraway place. It is a form of life, a way of portraying and imagining the world that is irrevocably lost for future generations. Monsieur le Président, les parties à un conflit sont...
President, parties to a conflict must take all necessary measures in order to protect cultural heritage. The destruction and looting of cultural heritage are war crimes, and they are strictly prohibited by international law, particularly the 1954 Convention, including Resolution 2347 of the Security Council. The perpetrators must be held accountable. The International Criminal Court has given an example in this regard. We must do our utmost to ensure that UNESCO can have unhindered access to cultural sites in situations of conflict. We encourage all countries to work directly with UNESCO for the protection of cultural heritage in war. What UNESCO is doing in Iraq at Mosul is a remarkable example. The work to revive the spirit of Mosul is a precious investment for reconciliation and the future of the country, as we have heard also from Mr. Altieri. The work of the Carabinieri for the protection of cultural heritage is also well known and well appreciated, and we would like to pay a well-deserved tribute to that. We support the idea that cultural heritage must be a part of UN missions, including special political missions. Allow me to conclude, Chair, recalling the value and the universal importance of cultural heritage. It represents the common heritage of mankind and bears out the ingenious nature of previous civilizations. That's why protecting cultural heritage in situations of conflict is therefore a responsibility beyond national borders. It calls for collective efforts and a continued approach at several levels in favor of human dignity. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Albania, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Merci le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Et on remercie aussi.
I would also like to thank the UAE
and Cyprus, et bien également Madame Azoulay, General Molinese, and Mr. Al-Tawil for your informative briefings. I join fellow members in commending the UN's work on this issue, which is as important as ever. The United States has been unwavering in its commitment to protecting and preserving cultural heritage. Our position is clear. The unlawful destruction of cultural heritage and the trafficking of cultural property are unacceptable. We recall UN Security Council Resolution 2347, and we note the unlawful destruction and illicit trafficking of cultural property are serious crimes and may endanger international peace and security. Threats to cultural resources may result in irreparable loss and damage of elements of importance for the history and identity of a country, as we've seen over the past year in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is waging a war of aggression that has destroyed parts of Ukraine's unique cultural heritage in an effort to rewrite history. This campaign has been in motion since 2014, when Russia began to remove artifacts, demolish grave sites, and shutter churches and other houses of worship in the Donbas region and Crimea. The damage to Ukraine's cultural heritage has only intensified since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February of 2022. In addition, the United States has entered into cultural property agreements with 3 countries where civil unrest or armed conflict has occurred in recent years: Libya, Mali, and Nigeria. Similar to many countries on the continent, Mali is confronted with looting of archaeological sites and illicit trafficking, an unfortunate phenomenon which has increased as a result of the escalation of the nation's crises and insecurity since 2012. The indiscriminate looting of archaeological sites, particularly of beautiful and ancient ceramics that represent the rich history of the Malian people, is alarming and becoming a serious emergency for its people, seeking to preserve their histories for future generations. In Syria, while the days of ISIS's public destruction of sites of a significant cultural or religious heritage may have come to an end, the terrorist group inflicted irreparable damage to the country's cultural heritage and antiquities. Former members of ISIS and other groups may still have the means to sell looted precious artifacts that could continue to provide a substantial revenue stream. Transnational organized crime has and will continue to feed the appetite for stolen antiquities from this region and around the world. Destruction of cultural heritage during armed conflict endangers the identity, the history, and the dignity of Ukrainian people. Attacks on cultural property may violate the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict, and the world is watching. The United States continues robust implementation of our own domestic tools for putting an end to destruction of cultural heritage and trafficking of cultural property in countries around the world, including those affected by conflict. We have instituted emergency import restrictions on cultural property from Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, which serve as a strong disincentive to would-be traffickers and help prevent terrorist financing and transnational organized crime. The United States has negotiated bilateral agreements with 25 countries to prevent illegal importation of archaeological and ethnological material into the United States. Import restrictions are imposed pursuant to cultural property agreements concluded with other state parties to the 1970 UNESCO Convention on the means of prohibiting and preventing illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property. We urge other states to the 1970 UNESCO Convention, whose heritage is in jeopardy from pillage, to request the same type of protection for their cultural patrimony from the United States. Our Cultural Heritage Coordinating Committee coordinates the activities of U.S. government agencies and institutions to protect and preserve international cultural property. In addition, the Cultural Antiquities Task Force, created by the State Department in 2004, focuses on the recovery and repatriation of looted cultural objects and supports law enforcement agencies in these efforts by sponsoring training, workshops, producing and circulating red lists of cultural objects at risk, and, inter alia, providing support to foreign governments in similar efforts. In conclusion, Monsieur le Président, on sharing relevant data and other information, the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation maintains the National Stolen Art File, a computerized database of stolen art and cultural property, and makes its information available to law enforcement agencies around the world. We remain fully committed to these efforts and look forward to coordinating with the United Nations and member states, including in the UN 1267 Committee, as well as international entities such as UNODC and Interpol over the coming year on full implementation of Resolution 2347. Et je vous remercie.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United States, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We're grateful to you for organizing today's event dedicated to a very relevant topic. The destruction of cultural heritage leads not only to the loss of material wealth, but also to grave damage to the culture and the history of the peoples that are affected. We have even prepared a statement for today's event that was dedicated to the topic of this event. However, having heard yet another stream of disinformation and false accusations directed at us on the topic of Ukraine, including the repeatedly disproven fake about the Palace of Culture in Mariupol, something that was disproven with the participation of the woman that was filled in that fake video, yet we continue hearing about it. Well, we have a legitimate question for the organizers of this event. Should we continue wasting our time and efforts putting together such detailed concept notes for these events when, in practice, the Western members of the Security Councils have no problems with speaking on other topics entirely, thus making the Council into a platform for the reading out of Russophobic mantras? Let's try to get down to the bottom of the real situation in Ukraine when it comes to cultural heritage. Thus, according to UNESCO's data, not a single item on the list has suffered in Ukraine during Russia's special military operation. The coordinates of those sites were provided to our armed forces in advance, which allowed us to take precautionary measures when planning combat activities. When it comes to the remaining sites and facilities, it is the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine that is refusing to provide UNESCO with guarantees that those sites and their environs will not be used for military purposes. Such assurances are a necessary legal precondition for providing additional protection to these sites. This refusal from the Ukrainian military is unsurprising, given their practice of placing combat points inside or near cultural or religious, educational, art, scientific, and historical sites in violation of international humanitarian law. The UNESCO Secretariat regularly receives detailed reports from us on attacks carried out by Ukrainian military personnel on cultural, religious, and historical sites just in the Donetsk People's and Luhansk People's Republics alone. They have destroyed or damaged some 103 such sites, including monasteries and religious buildings. Regrettably, UNESCO's Secretariat reports only include a small part of the information that is provided to us. It prefers to work selectively, issuing one-sided narratives based on the data provided by Ukraine. In addition, the data received from Kiev is not verified on the ground by UNESCO's Secretariat. On the eve of today's Arria meeting, just like in July of last year, a hasty two-day UNESCO visit was held to Odessa, Kiev, and Chernihiv. What could they have possibly have seen in such a short time? That's a rhetorical question. You could call the contents or the purpose of this meeting whatever you wish, but it can certainly not be called verification. A separate question is why they are traveling once again to Kiev instead of Luhansk or Donetsk, where since 2014 there remain a large number of sites that have been damaged or destroyed, and their list, unfortunately, only continues to grow. Another question we have to the head of UNESCO is why, following that visit, there was no reaction to the lawlessness being carried out by the Kiev regime against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And one of its key shrines, the Kievo-Petrorsk Church, which is right now being raided by Ukrainian authorities and seized, running counter not only to the country's constitution, but its international obligations. The leaders of that religious institution are being held under arrest, and the worshippers are being persecuted. Temples, churches are being usurped all over the country, and UNESCO continues to ignore all of this. According to the website or of the organization, the only outcome of the April visit of its head to Ukraine is translating further financial requests from Zelensky's puppet regime. Whereas the fact that the Kiev regime, as part of its crusade against the Orthodox Church, is sanctioning the destruction of churches and the persecution of clergy is something that the organization prefers to ignore. We would like to ask where UNESCO was throughout the entire 8 years that the Russian language population of Donbass was systematically persecuted along with their cultural sites and religious worship sites. You were silent when the band of nationalists that was brought to power in Kiev in 2014 by the US and the EU began to forcefully Ukrainianize half the population of the country, depriving people not only of their basic rights, but their very identity. We regularly transmitted information in this regard to UNESCO. We reported on monuments to Russian writers, poets, musicians, and heroes of World War II, which were destroyed. We reported on streets that were named in their honor that were subsequently renamed to honor Nazi collaborationists. We reported on the seizure and destruction of school books on the Russian language and Russian literature as a whole. But all we heard in response was silence. No less shameful is UNESCO's lack of reaction to the barbaric campaign of the West that in its Russophobic frenzy began canceling everything Russian books, films, music, and even the Russian language itself. Composers Peter Tchaikovsky, Shostakovich, Rachmaninoff are being pulled Plays are being banned based on the works of Russian classics, as well as performances by Russian performers and musicians, which are also being banned. Some cases are utterly ridiculous. The London National Gallery renamed Edgar Degas' painting Russian dancers to Ukrainian dancers. When it comes to the accusations we heard against us regarding the alleged systematic destruction of Ukrainian cultural property, their looting and trafficking, they simply do not stand up to criticism. This is shameless lying, pure and simple. A separate issue is the hypocrisy of the collective West, which has long ago turned into a true empire of lies. How can you lecture, in all seriousness, how can you lecture anyone on the looting and theft of cultural values with the kind of history and the kind of actions that you've engaged in? It is the states of the West who hold the record when it comes to the number of artifacts stolen from developing states during their colonial and neo-colonial conquests. The report ordered by the government of Emmanuel Macron in 2018 on the return of foreign cultural property noted that 90 to 95% of African cultural heritage is located outside of the continent in the world's large museums. France alone, in its museum, Musée de Quai Branly, has more than 70,000 objects that were taken out of Africa. Germany, just only in 2022, with great fanfare, returned a couple of dozen of exhibits to Nigeria from its collection of bronzes. These were depictions from a palace in Benin that was looted by British colonizers at the end of the 19th century. Only a couple dozen of the thousands of artifacts were returned in this magnanimous gesture. The UK has even less to show for itself. The British Museum continues to store more than 700 objects from the Kingdom of Benin alone. Instead of returning these stolen artifacts, the museum's curators are simply waxing lyrical. The museum's website, for example, has an entire section devoted to so-called contested objects. This, of course, refers to valuables that were illegally taken out of former colonies, and only the ones whose return is actively sought by their country of origin at that. And the list of countries is quite long. The United States did not manage to acquire vast colonies, unless you count a number of unincorporated island territories such as Puerto Rico, whose residents still do not have voting rights due to an ancient Supreme Court precedent dating to 1901 in the case of Downs versus Bidwell, which stated that although Puerto Rico belongs to the United States, it is constitutionally not part of the country because, and this is a quote, it is inhabited by foreign races that differ from us in their religion, customs, laws, taxation, and ways of thinking, and therefore governance and justice on the basis of Anglo-Saxon principles may be impossible for a time. Judging by the fact that the residents of Puerto Rico never obtained voting rights, the federal authorities continue to honor seemingly this decision of the Supreme Court. The fate of the indigenous populations that have encountered Americans leaves much to be desired in general. When building their own state, the U.S. systematically exterminated the indigenous population of the North American continent. Now they have a special U.S. government accountability office at the federal level, which calmly reports, and again, this is official information, on the fact that more than 116,000 human remains of Native Americans continue to remain in the collections of museums and other collections. 116,000 human remains, and this in the 21st century. And this is not to mention the countless cultural objects and works of art that have been stolen from the continent's indigenous population. appealing to the fact that this is all questions that belong to ancient history and that we've corrected our ways since then. Well, this will simply not do. The U.S. continues to demonstrate completely barbaric attitude to others' cultural heritage. The unprovoked, unjustified, aggressive war of choice of the U.S. against Iraq led not only to horrifying victims amongst the civilian population and destructions of infrastructure, the country lost the majority of its priceless cultural heritage. Having just invaded Iraq, Americans established their Camp Alpha military base directly next to ancient Babylonian temple ruins with a helicopter pad and 60-meter trenches. They seemingly couldn't find a better place to do this, and in clearing the site, they simply demolished some of the monuments. Some were subsequently taken out of the country. According to the official data from the John Malcolm Russell report prepared for the State Department in 2010, U.S. soldiers managed to destroy an area that would take 60 years to excavate with their various trenches. But in addition to this, they also built 42 football fields worth of roads and parking lots.
Le représentant,
I thank the representative, unless you wish to say a few words to conclude. Yes, I would like to take the opportunity to conclude. 30 seconds, says the president, because others need to speak as well. So you have 30 seconds. In 2003, in the context of the NATO invasion, the wealthy collections of the Iraqi National Museum was looted, including priceless artifacts. According to Russell, the author of that report, valuables from Iraq were openly sold on the U.S. market, and there was not a single case of law enforcement looking into this. Many of those works will then resurface in private collections in the U.S. and other Western countries. Overall, 130,000 objects were taken out, and only 18 were returned from developed countries. And the least valuable ones is that the same situation was then seen in Syria, where the unlawful occupation continues of part of its territory. Thank you. I thank you, says the president. I thank the representative of Russia for abridging his statement. And I now give the floor to Malta.
Merci, l'ambassadeur. And I would also like to thank UAE, Cyprus, and Italy for convening today's meeting. I also thank DG Azoulay, General Molinese, and Mr. Al-Tawil for their very interesting and informative briefings today. Malta recalls that cultural heritage is an important vehicle for peace, democracy, and sustainable development. It leads to tolerance, mutual understanding, reconciliation, intercultural and interfaith dialogue, and mitigating social tensions. Regretfully, cultural heritage is still a target in conflict, and despite efforts to preserve it in armed conflict, it remains under grave attack. Recently in Sudan, museums have been caught in the crossfire, and pro-democracy artists and other activists are being targeted. In Yemen, the ongoing conflict has been devastating, with UNESCO cultural heritage sites suffering collateral damage and thousands of ancient and Islamic artifacts being looted and smuggled out of the country. In Ukraine, UNESCO estimates that over 250 cultural sites have been damaged since Russia's aggression. In Syria and Iraq, terrorist groups such as Daesh and Al-Qaeda have attacked and destroyed cultural artifacts, buildings, and monuments in an attempt to divide communities, erase their shared values, and destroy the social fabric, while creating a breeding ground for extremist ideology. They have also exploited cultural sites to finance their activities while strengthening their links with transnational organized crime. We stress that maintaining peace and security necessitates the protection of cultural professionals and artists, and that this matter should be followed more closely by the United Nations, including the Security Council. Attacks on cultural heritage are not only targeting one particular group. Such acts are crimes against the international community. We cannot afford to allow specific cultural patrimonies to be irreparably lost. The destruction of cultural heritage may also have a detrimental and irreversible impact on the enjoyment of human rights, including the rights to freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief. Malta supports UNESCO's mission to protect cultural heritage in the event of armed conflict and encourages the organization to continue to pursue and strengthen its actions on the ground. Chair, Malta recalls Security Council Resolution 2347, which called on all states to take preventative steps to safeguard cultural property in their territory from the foreseeable effects of conflict, fight against the illicit trafficking in cultural property, and undertake all appropriate efforts for the recovery of cultural heritage. Security Council Resolution 2347 constitutes a solid legal framework towards the protection of cultural property in armed conflict. It is imperative for all states to honor it in both spirit and letter. In addition, customs officials around the world, and more particularly those bordering conflict zones, have to be further sensitized to be on the lookout for trafficking in such goods. Auction houses also have a role to play. The criminalization of smuggled cultural goods goes part of the way to address greed of cultural traffickers and bring them to justice. Anchoring culture in public policies and adapting to these contemporary challenges will require more systematic participation of diverse stakeholders and addressing the social and gender gaps that limit women's participation in the cultural value chain. The advancement of such heritage should be a driver of reconciliation and peace. Moreover, protecting cultural heritage as part of peacekeeping mandates can be instrumental in efforts to protect vulnerable citizens and promote dialogue and political settlements between parties to a conflict. Chair, in closing, I reiterate that Malta is committed to strengthening international cooperation to protect and preserve the world's priceless cultural heritage, including in armed conflict. The result of inaction will have devastating consequences. Je vous remercie.
Merci, le représentant de Malte.
I thank the representative of Malta, and I now give the floor to Ecuador, Monica.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank the delegations of the United Arab Emirates and France and the co-sponsors, Italy and Cyprus, for organising this meeting. I also thank the briefers for their briefings and the work carried out by their institutions to preserve cultural heritage in situations of conflict. We recognise the work done by UNESCO, particularly as we've heard from the Director General, Ms. Azoulay, in complex current situations such as Yemen, Iraq and Ukraine. We further underscore what was said by General Moilez and Mr. Al-Tawil on the need to cooperate with countries and use technological tools that make it possible to act quickly and with control in preserving cultural heritage. In this context, Ecuador would like to express its thanks for the readiness of these organizations in our region, and we would like to express our availability to continue the joined-up work both for our region and the rest of the world. Chairman, the unlawful destruction, looting and trafficking of cultural heritage not only harms the places and populations in affected areas, but also cause incalculable damage to our understanding of our common history and our shared humanity. Protecting this heritage is a humanitarian imperative and security imperative because it can significantly contribute to reconciliation and peace in a post-conflict scenario. Resolution 2347 of 2017 is consistent with recognising the relevance of cultural heritage, both in order to preserve the sense of identity for a community, but also due to its historic meaning for humanity as a whole. This recognition was already enshrined in the Hague Convention of 1954 for the protection of cultural goods in the case of armed conflict and the two protocols thereto, as well as the conventions agreed at UNESCO in 1970 and 1972. In addition, the Rome Statute in Article 8 criminalizes attacks on historic monuments as war crimes. It grants jurisdiction to the International Criminal Court for the trial and conviction of perpetrators of these crimes, and this occurred in the Al-Mahdi case. Despite the robust international normative and legal framework to avoid and address crimes against cultural heritage, its destruction and trafficking appears to have been on the rise over the last few years as a consequence of the increasing conflicts, the use of illegal trading networks for their trafficking, and the pandemic. The pandemic indeed weakened monitoring capacities for heritage sites. Added to that, terrorist groups are increasingly resorting to trafficking cultural goods as a source of funding. Bearing in mind that more than 6 years have passed since the adoption of Resolution 2347, we think that it is timely to have a discussion on how we can strengthen its implementation. We also believe we should be looking at the strategies and policies for the protection of cultural heritage in all of its dimensions. In this context, my delegation would like to make the following 4 suggestions. Firstly, we must promote states' adherence to international instruments protecting cultural heritage, including those related to international criminal justice. Secondly, we should raise awareness to among peacekeeping personnel as to the importance of preserving cultural heritage for communities and international norms that protect cultural heritage. This would further feed information back to our assessment as to whether or not it might be helpful to incorporate the protection of cultural and historic sites in the mandate of peacekeeping operations. Thirdly, we must promote an international system for the tracking and recovery of plundered cultural goods and the protection of cultural heritage during armed conflicts. This calls for greater cooperation between organizations such as UNESCO, Interpol, the World Customs Organization, and the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, as well as the involvement of the private sector. Fourth, and recognizing that the responsibility of preserving and protecting cultural heritage falls primarily on states, United Nations agencies and other organizations can contribute to generating internal capacity that makes it possible to reach that aim. For this reason, and in light of the urgent situation posed by new threats, we must continue striving to protect cultural heritage. Its importance as a symbol of collective human identity can play an important role in social cohesion and reconciliation processes within communities. Thank you very much.
Merci.
I thank the representative of Ecuador, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Chair. I also wish to commend France, UAE, as well as Cyprus and Italy for organizing this very important Arria Formula meeting. We also thank Ms. Audrey Azoulay, Director General of UNESCO, and all the briefers for their insightful perspectives. Despite the importance of cultural heritage in enhancing social cohesion for peace, we remain concerned about its exploitation by various actors, including non-state armed groups in conflict settings. More worrying is the increasing crimes relating to the looting and trafficking of cultural heritage in those conflict situations. We therefore welcome the focus of today's meeting, which seeks to explore ways by which the implementation of mechanisms at the national, regional, and international level can help to salvage the situation. In addressing the issue, we believe that the existing instruments in the multilateral system, including the 1954 Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in Armed Conflict, the UNESCO Conventions, as well as the provisions in the Security Council Resolution 2347, remain useful in protecting our cultural heritage, especially in conflict settings. We encourage states that are yet to ratify these instruments to do so. It is also important for states to enhance implementation through the setting up of national services for the protection of cultural heritage. While it is essential to align national legislations with these instruments, the inclusion of relevant stakeholders, such as cultural heritage experts, CSOs, and local communities, particularly women and youth, in interventions to protect and preserve our cultural heritage is also essential. A whole-of-society approach is indispensable in the preservation of our cultural heritage. At the multilateral level, the deepening of cooperation between UN bodies, such as UNESCO and all relevant stakeholders, with regional organizations such as the African Union is essential. This will serve as an impetus in the implementation of regional mechanisms such as the Charter for African Cultural Renaissance and the African Union Plan of Action on Cultural and Creative Industries in combating the menace. We believe that tangible and intangible cultural heritage has a critical role to play in building resilience, security, and humanitarian action. The values embedded in cultural heritage have, for instance, helped to prevent conflict in communities by creating trust, encouraging empathy, raising awareness, and inspiring tolerance around societal differences. Ghana, on its part, is fully committed to safeguarding our cultural heritage through targeted policies and strengthening institutions. One such policy is the Declaration of the Year of Return and Beyond the Return, which seeks to foster relations between Africans and the African diaspora for development. Going forward, it is crucial for concerted action to be taken to combat the illicit trafficking of cultural objects in conflict settings, the enhancement of cooperation relating to mutual legal assistance, deploying the media in disseminating information on the theft and pillaging of cultural property, and building of capacity of monitoring and law enforcement agencies such as the police and customs services are all ways by which we can nib the menace in the bud. In conclusion, Ghana believes that it is in our own interest to demonstrate stronger political will in upholding our cultural heritage, since it is at the heart of addressing the drivers of instability for lasting peace to prevail. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Italy, Maurizio.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, chairs. Let me first thank France and the United Arab Emirates for organizing this meeting that we co-sponsored together with Cyprus. This event marks an important occasion 6 years after the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2347. I also would like to thank the three briefers for their remarkable insights. The protection of cultural heritage is among the pillars of Italy's foreign policy. Italy is, as well known, is a long-standing partner of UNESCO. And safeguarding of cultural heritage is a multifaceted challenge that cannot be met with the traditional means. Since the first acts of terrorism against cultural heritage, UNESCO launched an awareness-raising campaign named United for Heritage and urged the international community to seek shared solutions and tools. Italy has been on the front line of this global campaign, and in 2016, together with UNESCO, we established the world's first emergency task force for culture, the Blue Helmets for Culture, that have been employed on many occasions ever since, both nationally and internationally, to help other countries develop similar capabilities. I'm particularly glad that General Molinese could brief this esteemed audience, showcasing the activity carried out both in Italy and abroad by the Carabinieri Command for the Protection of Cultural Heritage. Cultural heritage is a catalyzer of peace and dialogue among different cultures, civilizations, religions, and generations. It cements identity, builds social cohesion, fosters resilience in times of crisis, and promotes values such as tolerance, respect, and inclusivity. Any deliberate attack against cultural heritage is therefore an attack against the future of humanity, as it hampers post-conflict recovery and peace building, deprives minority groups of their roots, and fuels conflicts and hatred. Ensuring accountability and bringing the perpetrators of crimes against cultural heritage to justice is also crucial, also to prevent future attacks. These are the reasons behind France and Italy initiative to promote the adoption of a Security Council Resolution 2347 in 2017 the first Security Council resolution on the protection of cultural heritage during armed conflicts. The same reasons have informed our actions ever since, and I'm particularly appreciative of the interest and many suggestions that this meeting brought about on how to better operationalize Resolution 2347 and keep the protection of cultural heritage at the forefront of our action. Defending cultural heritage is an imperative if we want to build a sustainable peace. In light of the above, in the last few years, Italy has financed many UNESCO restoration and conservation projects of endangered sites in the Mediterranean, in Iraq, in Africa, and in Asia. In the context of Italy's overall support to Ukraine and its people after the illegal Russian aggression, the Italian Blue Helmets for Culture Task Force, in cooperation with the Italian Civil Protection Department, has dispatched the technical materials for securing and salvaging Ukraine's cultural heritage that was destroyed, damaged, or threatened during the war. Italy actively supported the inclusion of the city of Odessa in UNESCO's World Heritage List and in the list of the endangered sites. We support Ukraine refugee artists, and we are ready to stand by Ukraine to tackle trafficking and to reconstruct its damaged heritage once the conditions on the ground are met. Chairs, Italy is fully convinced that culture is a global public good. We therefore stand ready, in cooperation with UNESCO and our partners, to advance the dossier on the protection of cultural heritage at the United Nations and on the field. And I thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Cyprus. I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Cyprus.
Je vous remercie, Nicolas.
Thank you, Nicolas.
Let me start by thanking France and the United Arab Emirates for convening this Security Council Arria Formula meeting with the co-sponsorship of Italy and Cyprus. I also wish to express our appreciation to our briefers for their invaluable contribution. As stated in the 1954 Hague Convention, the damage to cultural property belonging to any people whatsoever means damage to the cultural heritage of all mankind. The loss is collective, and action to prevent such a loss should be therefore collective and unified. International law stipulates that the deliberate targeting or plundering of religious, historic, and cultural sites is prohibited in times of war. The intentional destruction of cultural heritage is a war crime under the Rome Statute. It violates human rights and has a detrimental and irreversible impact on the enjoyment of cultural rights, including the ability to access and enjoy cultural heritage. In fact, through attacks on cultural heritage, perpetrators seek to uproot the cultural and ethnological connection of the local population from their land. Cyprus has a long and painful history of foreign invasions that led to the destruction and looting of its cultural heritage. We therefore have a long-standing priority to contribute effectively to the efforts of the international community to combat illicit trafficking and to ensure the repatriation of stolen cultural property. In that regard, we welcome significant developments in relation to the protection of cultural heritage, including Security Council Resolution 2347, which is the first ever resolution with a focus on the protection of cultural heritage and its important contribution to peace and security as a source of stability and inclusion, as well as a driver of reconciliation and resilience. Upon Cyprus' initiative, Human Rights Council adopted in 2016 a resolution entitled Cultural Rights and Protection of Cultural Heritage, supported by a cross-regional group of member states. Cyprus is proud to be the pen-holder of this triennium Human Rights Council resolution, the latest being Resolution A/HRSC/49/L8, adopted in 2022, that should be seen as complementing Security Council Resolution 2347. In addition, during the Cyprus chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe in 2016-2017, the Convention on Offences Relating to Cultural Property, also known as the Nicosia Convention, was adopted. It was indeed the landmark achievement of our presidency, since the said convention constitutes the first ever international legal text incorporating a criminal code for perpetrators who destroy, steal, or trade cultural heritage treasures. Key characteristics include the fact that the burden of proof lies with the buyer or possessor of the artifact. The Convention is open for signature and accession by all member states. Our aim is to make this new instrument truly universal. Therefore, we are seeking today measures to protect cultural heritage. We invite all UN member states to consider acceding to the Nicosia Convention. Turning to the issue of strengthening the implementation of existing international and regional instruments, we need to focus on accountability. The International Criminal Court's Al-Mahdi case is a landmark decision to that direction. The ICC verdict was a clear message that crimes against cultural heritage will not be tolerated and cannot go unpunished. Accountability of state and non-state perpetrators is not only essential but a prerequisite for the protection of cultural heritage. Mr. Chair, the protection of culture in time of conflict should be considered in a consistent and holistic manner to better respond to attacks on culture, as well as to assist the governments in peace-building and recovery processes. In particular, the return and restitution of cultural heritage should be seen as a conduit for peace, while support should be given for cultural protection and preservation as part of peace-building efforts. The adoption of gender-sensitive and inclusive approach to the protection of cultural heritage is a sine qua non. To conclude, Cyprus, as co-chair of the Group of Friends for the Protection of Cultural Heritage, along with Italy, intends to revive the Group of Friends at the very near future to bring protection of cultural heritage at the heart of the UN system. I thank you.
I thank the Ambassador of Cyprus, dear Andreas. I'll now be leaving you and I'll hand over the presidency to my friend Mohammed from the UAE. Thank you, Nicola.
Continue down our speakers list. I would just like to kindly remind delegations to respect the 3 minutes and to keep their statements brief so that we can get through the speakers list before we lose interpretation. I now give the floor to the representative of Iraq. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At the outset, I would like to thank the United Arab Emirates, France, Italy, and Cyprus for their effective efforts and significant efforts towards holding this meeting, which represents one of the priorities of the Iraqi government. I would like also to thank the briefers, Ms. Azoulay, Mr. Molinez, and Mr. Attawil from Mosul for the informative briefings. Mr. Chair, today I would like to recall the brutal terrorist attack launched against my country at the hands of terrorist groups, where they targeted a civilization that harkens back to thousands of years. Meanwhile, safe and secure religions and cities were denigrated, assaulted, attacked, in addition to the attempts to efface the history thereof by destroying the places of worship, archaeological sites, rape, and displacement. In this regard, I would like to underscore the resolution of the Security Council 2347 of 2017, as this resolution stressed that Iraq, in collaboration with the relevant organizations and states, is tracing the looted Iraqi antiquities, which were looted during various intervals and various phases of the conflict, especially under the control of Daesh and Al-Qaeda. Iraq collaborated with the United Nations in issuing a number of decisions, and I personally was honored by issuing 2 decisions in 2015, or 2 resolutions. The first, in collaboration with Germany, where we worked on the General Assembly Resolution 281, which maintains a unified international position regarding the conservation of Iraqi heritage and patrimony and protecting the same using legal instruments and the Security Council relevant resolutions, especially those related to counterterrorism. This resolution laid the foundations for connecting the full spectrum of national Iraqi identity and its cultural patrimony as one of the elements to build social cohesion and peace building. The second resolution was issued by the Security Council under number 2199, where paragraphs 15, 16, and 17 focused on preventing illicit trade of cultural property as this relates to the financing of terrorism by Daesh. Iraq, in collaboration and partnership with a number of friendly countries, and especially the United States, regarding the repatriation of illicitly traded antiquities, and the collaboration with the Italian Carabinieri, and our collaboration with France. We agreed with France in January this year to cooperate on countering the looting of archaeological sites. Iraq, with the support of magnanimous support, and generous grants, managed to rehabilitate some of the archaeological sites in the liberated areas, in addition to the awareness-raising and educational projects such as the initiative of the Spirit of Mosul, which tries to revive this distressed city and to rehabilitate the population of Mosul, notwithstanding their ethnicities and their religions. Mr. Chair, I would like to stress that Iraq, notwithstanding all the social, financial, and technical difficulties and challenges, is determined to protect its cultural and humanitarian patrimony and heritage in collaboration with the international community. In conclusion, I would like to thank the Secretary, Ms. Ozolay, and all the staff of UNESCO for their valuable and long-term work. I would like also to express my gratitude for the generous and magnanimous support of donors to Iraq, such as the UAE, Italy, France, the United States, Japan, Germany, and many others, to protect the Iraqi heritage, which is a very important part of the world heritage. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to Iraq.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to warmly thank France and the United Arab Emirates for organizing today's meeting, co-sponsored by the permanent missions of Cyprus and Italy, as well as our briefers for the very comprehensive and interesting presentations. Over the last few years, violence against cultural heritage has become a constant feature of conflicts. We have witnessed it in Syria, Iraq, Mali, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. This violence takes various forms: deliberate attacks against cultural or historic monuments as a tactic of war, military operations against important pieces of cultural property that have turned into military objective, and even the destruction of objects as incidental damage. It is also noteworthy that the collateral damage of the said conflict is the looting of antiquities and the illicit trafficking and trade by terrorist groups in order to use them as a source of financing. Resolution 2347 of 2017 was the first Security Council resolution exclusively devoted to the overall issue of the protection of cultural heritage in the event of armed conflict. Given the even evolving nature of the armed conflicts and the destructive impact on cultural heritage, there is an urgent need to further enhance its implementation. Apart from the Security Council, the protection of cultural heritage in armed conflict situations, including its illicit trafficking as a cultural damage, is equally addressed by the General Assembly. In this regard, I would like to recall the unanimously adopted General Assembly Resolution 7616 of 2021 on the return or restitution of cultural property to the countries of origin, introduced and coordinated by Greece, which gathered the unprecedented number of 111 co-sponsors member states. An issue that Greece would also like to highlight in the context of today's meeting is that acts against cultural heritage can have varying impacts on victims or group of victims, spiritually, economically, educationally, and undermine the enjoyment of a range of human rights, including cultural rights. For instance, during armed conflicts, the intangible cultural heritage is damaged as well. When groups of people or entire communities are forced to move, the damage to the tradition and customs, whether religious or cultural, is immeasurable. As regards good practice and lessons learned, I would like to highlight that in December 2021, my country launched the Greek Military Manual for the Protection of Cultural Property in Armed Conflict, which is intended to serve as a practical guide to the implementation of the relevant rules of international law. It combines a military-focused account of the relevant international legal obligations with suggestions as to best military practice at the different levels of command and during the different phases of military operations, whether by land, sea or air. Mr. Chair, in concluding, let me assure you that Greece, in light also of its candidature as a non-permanent member of the Security Council for 2025-2026, is ready to contribute to the overall discussion of the protection of cultural heritage in armed conflict and be part of any initiative that should be undertaken in this regard. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece, and I give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, and distinguished colleagues. I would like to thank the organizers for this important Arria Formula meeting, as well as to thank you to briefers for your substantive presentations and the valuable work you do. For Ukraine, protection of cultural heritage remains an issue of primary significance as we defend our country from full-scale Russian invasion. And we highly appreciate the activities of UNESCO in protection of cultural heritage in Ukraine and worldwide. In July last year, Ukraine, Poland, and Albania, along with a large group of co-sponsors, held an Arria Formula meeting to address the devastating impact of the Russian war against Ukraine in the cultural domain. Since that time, the situation has significantly worsened. I would like to share a few points we deem useful in further addressing this issue. First, in a war of aggression, cultural heritage of an attacked state is often considered as a deliberate target when an aggressor attempts to destroy the national identity of people and erase their historical background. The number of crimes against Ukrainian cultural heritage has reached alarming levels. In particular, UNESCO has already verified damage to 249 cultural heritage sites, including over 100 religious ones belonging to Christian, Islamic, and Jewish communities. The Ukrainian authorities have documented over 500 episodes of damage and destruction of cultural sites. The difference in number is explained by the lack of access of UNESCO to the combat areas and longer process of verification. Second, crimes against culture also aim at undermining the key humanistic values lying in the core of our common commitment to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The modern-day barbarians try to drag the world down to their level of barbarians and cruelty. Russian troops have the same motivation as ISIS that captured Palmyra 8 years ago in May and later destroyed World Heritage sites there. Third, looting of cultural property in the war of aggression serves as an instrument of a negative cultural appropriation, which is an element of neocolonialism. In our case, the cultural looting is supposed to underpin the Russian narrative about Russians and Ukrainians as, I quote, the same people, used to substantiate Russian claims for Ukraine as its legitimate sphere of influence. The occupied territories of Ukraine have become an area of cultural looting on an industrial scale. Fourth point, particularly relevant for those accusing the whole world in their own crimes, is accountability. Ensuring inevitable justice for war crimes should also include responsibility for perpetrators of crimes against cultural heritage, compensation for damage and destruction, as well as restitution of stolen and looted cultural property. The United Nations General Assembly Resolution ES 11/5 on remedy and reparation for aggression against Ukraine, adopted last November, is the first step in this direction. Fifth, as it has been already mentioned by a number of representatives today, the Security Council Resolution 2347 remains an important tool to reinforce international cooperation in support of the respective efforts of UNESCO and other relevant international organizations. At the same time, its particular focus on the activities of the international criminal groups and terrorist groups should be complemented with increasing attention to the crimes against cultural heritage committed by states. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine, and I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Monsieur le Président, Excellences, merci d'avoir organisé.
Mr. President, Excellencies, thank you for organizing this debate, which underscores the importance and the unique nature of Resolution 2342, recognizing the often ignored threat that attacks on cultural heritage create for international peace and security, and underscoring the link between the looting of cultural goods and the financing of terrorism. Due to the identity-building character of cultural heritage, its protection from destruction in the context of armed conflicts is an essential factor in restoring and maintaining peace and rebuilding war-torn societies. It is essential in building the resilience of nations and to give the affected populations hope and means to nourish their cultural identity and pass it on to future generations. This strength-inducing power of one's cultural identity is often precisely why the cultural heritage is attacked in the first place, to undermine the basis of nations and what defines them, their future, and sometimes their existence. In this regard, let me confess that in Poland, we are very sensitive to the issue of the destruction of cultural heritage, bearing in mind our historical experience. We understand too well what the loss of cultural heritage means in terms of identity and development. The wars of the past century deprived us of historic architecture, art collections, libraries, and archives. The topics addressed during today's discussion are particularly valid these days in light of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Since the very beginning, the destruction of Ukrainian cultural heritage, accompanied by wide-scale and well-organized looting of cultural property, has been an integral part of the Russian invasion. Poland condemns with the strongest firmness the blind use of Russian force against Ukrainian infrastructure, critical infrastructure, holding Russia accountable for all the crimes committed in Ukraine, including against its cultural heritage, requires ensuring that Ukraine receives adequate war reparations. That is why a significant part of our assistance to Ukraine and related to safeguarding the cultural heritage of the country. From the very first days of the war, the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage of Poland has been organizing assistance to Ukrainian cultural institutions and their staff, such as technical and material assistance to protect museums, monuments, and other cultural sites. Poland fully supports the efforts undertaken by UNESCO with the aim of protecting Ukrainian heritage, particularly the establishment of a special UNESCO assistance program, as well as its decision to prolong the emergency assistance program. I would like to conclude by expressing my appreciation to Director General Audrey Azoulay for her visit to Ukraine in early April and the in-depth discussion she had with the Polish Deputy Prime Minister, Ministry of Culture and National Heritage in Warsaw. Thank you.
Poland, and I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Chairman. At the outset, we'd like to express our thanks to your country, United Arab Emirates, to France, Cyprus, and Italy. We thank you for convening this meeting. We'd also like to thank the briefers for their briefings. The protection of cultural heritage in armed conflicts is a fundamental matter because it is a reflection of life, history, and the identity of a community. Despite the robust provisions of Resolution 2347 of the Security Council, as well as those provisions contained in different international instruments, regrettably, on many occasions, as we've heard this afternoon, the parties to a conflict, in violation of these norms, have harmed or destroyed the artistic and cultural heritage of countries such as Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen. The war in Ukraine and now the clashes in Sudan are no exception. In this context, Mexico is concerned at the reports on the situation for some museums in Khartoum that are caught in the crossfire between the warring sides. We call for an immediate ceasefire. Security Council Resolution 2347 is categorical in urging states to cooperate with investigations, with the seizure and confiscation of assets to return, restore, or repatriate cultural goods that have been the subject of trafficking, export, import, that have been stolen, looted, excavated, or illegally traded. We must strengthen not only mechanisms to step up our combating of the illicit trafficking of cultural goods, but also the full implementation of this resolution, including repatriation. In 2022, Mexico hosted Mondiacult. The final statement of the declaration from that was signed by 150 countries. It highlighted the commitment to fight the illegal trafficking of cultural goods, and it asked UNESCO to step up its work related to the repercussions of illicit trafficking on memory, identity, and the future of peoples, fostering the inclusion of criminal or administrative sanctions in national law. To conclude, Mexico reiterates that cultural heritage is unique, non-renewable, and exemplifies the memory of who we are, and it must be protected at all costs for that reason. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mexico, and I give the floor to the representative of Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Chair. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for holding these discussions and the briefers for their informative presentations. Azerbaijan has consistently promoted international humanitarian law and the principles and rules governing the protection of cultural property in armed conflict at the international level. Thus, for example, among other efforts, Azerbaijan initiated the adoption by the Human Rights Council of the Resolution on the Protection of Cultural Rights and Property in Situations of Armed Conflict, as well as contributed to the drafting and publication of the UNESCO Military Manual on the Protection of Cultural Property. States and international organizations have expended considerable efforts to develop a sophisticated body of international law for the protection of cultural property in armed conflict. In addition, both the General Assembly and the Security Council addressed the protection of culture in conflict situations, highlighting in particular the connection of the destruction of and trafficking in cultural heritage with terrorism and organized crime. Security Council Resolution 2347 recognized that unlawful destruction, looting, and smuggling of cultural property in the event of armed conflict and the attempt to deny historical roots and cultural diversity in this context can undermine security, stability, governance, social, economic, and cultural development of affected states. Impunity for war crimes against cultural heritage remains one of the major impediments to peace, justice, and reconciliation in some parts of the world. Furthermore, racist ideologies and ethnic and religious hatred are often the driving force behind attacks on cultural heritage and thus require enhanced attention. It is also critical that the UN continue confronting disinformation aimed at targeting distinct cultural heritage and concealing scientific evidence. In this sense, it is not difficult to predict that the comments that Armenia is going to make late at this meeting will fully fit into the logic of such disinformation. It would be quite surprising to hear something different from a mono-ethnic country, which is responsible for mass atrocities against Azerbaijani cultural heritage, committed on a racially discriminatory basis with the purpose to advance ethno-nationalist goals and deny and distort Azerbaijani history, culture, and ethnic identity. We have consistently provided UNESCO and the international community as a whole with extensive detail on Azerbaijani cultural heritage, which has been looted, vandalized, desecrated, and destroyed both throughout Armenia and in the formerly occupied territories of my country. The facts are really shocking and unprecedented. Suffice it to mention just a few. Thus, out of 67 mosques in the formerly occupied territory, 65 were destroyed. The deliberate use of mosques as pens for peaks and coves during the occupation was a potent and symbolic action intended as a particular insult. Over 900 cemeteries in those territories were either destroyed or desecrated. They were targeted deliberately due to the family, historical, and cultural importance to our people. These and numerous other offenses have been internationally condemned in the strongest possible terms. However, international organizations have not been allowed to verify the state of Azerbaijani cultural heritage in Armenia and in the territories of Azerbaijan when they were under occupation. Azerbaijan instituted proceedings before the International Court of Justice to hold Armenia accountable for the violations of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. In concluding, respect for the sovereignty of states must be the fundamental prerequisite across all protection efforts. This was clearly stressed in Security Council Resolution 2347. Azerbaijan is keen to continue its efforts towards promoting mutual understanding and diversity and looks forward to enhanced cooperation with all stakeholders in achieving these goals. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Azerbaijan. وأعطي الكلمة لممثل اليمن.
And I now give the floor to Yemen. Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank France, the UAE, for holding today's important meeting with the participation of Cyprus and Italy. We all know that countries living in a situation of conflict or post-conflict are those that most lack the capacity and resources to implement international instruments to protect cultural heritage in armed conflict, and are the ones that most need and most want to strengthen their capacities. This meeting takes place some days before the return to the government of Yemen of several works of art dating from the 5th century BC. We also were able to return 70 architectural items, and we thank the U.S. authorities involved for having returned these architectural items which were illicitly exported. This was all thanks to fruitful cooperation between our countries. Mr. President, our civilization is a very ancient one. The south of the Arabian Peninsula was home to some very ancient civilizations that spread their good reputation throughout their planet. And this is why Yemen has always been called the Happy Yemen. Yemen is home to a historic, unique civilization and heritage. We must protect and preserve this heritage. During the conflict, many architectural sites and antiquities were destroyed, pillaged. And this was all taking place at a large scale and unlawfully, particularly in territories under Houthi militia control. They continue to attempt to erase Yemen's cultural heritage and have destroyed a large number of sites that have great religious and architectural significance. This reflects the intolerance of these militias and their lack of desire to respect coexistence between religions and civilizations. They also use the proceeds from the sale of these archaeological artifacts to finance their activities. In this context, the Yemeni government is making major efforts, particularly in liberated areas, to protect cultural heritage and bolster emergency procedures for the return of lost or looted items. Efforts are also underway to strengthen the capacities of all government agencies working on historical heritage. We have reopened a number of museums. The Museum of Haramut, for example, was closed for over 10 years after being subjected to destruction and looting by armed groups during their control over that territory. The museum's authorities have restored the museum and reopened it to the public. There is no doubt that cultural heritage is also an economic asset and an element that contributes to a prosperous future. That is why the government of Yemen seeks to step up cooperation and coordination with all states in order to preserve cultural property and put an end to their illicit trafficking through capacity building in the area of protecting archaeological sites and museums, as well as by supporting priority projects in this area. Government agencies are the first line of defense and the most efficient in addressing this destruction and looting. To conclude, Mr. President, Yemen's cultural heritage is due to the conflict, and trafficking has been systematically exposed to great danger. We call on all states to take the necessary measures in order to guarantee the safe return of all cultural property to Yemen and to all items of historic, cultural, or religious value which were illegally stolen or looted from Yemen to be returned. This includes introducing sanctions on the trafficking of such items. We call on the Security Council to take the necessary measures to protect historic cultural heritage of Yemen and to ensure that the relevant pieces are returned to Yemen. I thank the representative of Yemen, says the president, and give the floor to the representative of Armenia.
Permanent missions of France and the United Arab Emirates and co-sponsors for convening today's meeting. And I thank the distinguished briefers for their valuable remarks and welcome the participation of Director General Azoulay. The UNESCO has an important mandate in protecting cultural heritage at risk, and I would like to acknowledge the critical role of that organization in this regard. Armed conflicts and military actions can have devastating impact on objects of cultural heritage, which are of irreplaceable value to the entire mankind as unique expressions of history, identity, and cultural memory. As such, their integrity and preservation must be upheld at all times. In our region, we have first-hand experience going through the devastating loss of cultural property. The Armenian heritage was under heavy attack during the war in Nagorno-Karabakh launched by Azerbaijan in 2020. The Holy Savior Ghazan Tsechot's Cathedral of Shushi, for example, was deliberately shelled twice within a few hours, resulting in partial destruction of church. Today, the millennial-old Armenian Christian sites in Nagorno-Karabakh are on the verge of total extermination, targeted to promote the distorted narrative that the Armenian people are alien in the region. Armenia's deep concern in relation to the fate of the cultural property in Nagorno-Karabakh is also based on the previous history of total and intentional eradication of the Armenian heritage by Azerbaijan. In Nakhichevan only, thousands of monuments, including 89 medieval churches, and more than 5,000 crossstones were annihilated in an effort to remove traces of the Armenian civilizational presence. Azerbaijan is yet to commit in good faith to the implementation of the Order of Provisional Measures issued by the International Court of Justice at the request of Armenia in December 2021, according to which Azerbaijan shall, and I quote, take all necessary measures to prevent and punish acts of vandalism and desecration affecting Armenian cultural heritage, including but not limited to churches and other places of worship, monuments, landmarks, cemeteries, and artifacts, unquote. Dear colleagues, Armenia has consistently requested that a UNESCO fact-finding mission be deployed to Nagorno-Karabakh and the adjacent areas in order to help preserve the vast and unique cultural heritage of the region. Yet Azerbaijan continues to obstruct efforts of the international organizations for independent and impartial assessment of the facts on the ground, having opted instead for a policy of systematic erasure of the Armenian traces, putting into practice pseudo-scientific theory that denies the historical sites of Armenian origin. Only today, the chairman of what is called the State Committee for Work with Religious Organizations of Azerbaijan went on record saying that medieval Armenian Dadivank Monastery, quote, belongs to Caucasian Albania, and, quote again, sooner or later it will be controlled by Albanian Udi religious community, unquote. Destruction of the Armenian cultural heritage in the territories under Azerbaijani control continues to be extensively monitored and reported, including through the use of modern technologies. And I would like to recall in this regard that on 28 April, last Friday, Armenia hosted a panel discussion at the UN which looked into the role of new technologies in preventing genocidal acts such as cultural heritage destruction. The event featured a research project at the Cornell University entitled Caucasus Heritage Watch, which relies on digital satellite technologies to monitor and document cultural heritage in the region, revealing large-scale damage and destruction in the territories under Azerbaijan control. Dear colleagues, I would like to conclude my intervention by encouraging UNESCO to utilize modern digital technologies to identify, monitor, and act upon the facts of destruction of cultural heritage in any part of the world, and in our region in particular, which will allow also to internationally refute all the distasteful narrative of the representative of Azerbaijan that we had to hear earlier. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Armenia, and I give the floor to the representative of Hungary.
Thank you, Chair, and first of all, thank you very much to all the co-sponsors for organizing this event on this very important topic today. Like others have emphasized as well, this past decade has unleashed a period of complex global security challenges with a scarcity of stability and the proliferation of conflicts throughout the world, which has led to increasing levels of destruction of tangible and intangible cultural heritage. The protection of cultural heritage is a crucial and indispensable instrument for peace, reconciliation, as well as inclusive and sustainable development. The destruction of tangible and intangible cultural heritage can severely impact and endanger social cohesion and peaceful coexistence of peoples and lead to the escalation of conflicts. This strong correlation has been recognized and exploited. Regarding the preventative dimension, we must address a key aspect to safeguarding cultural heritage, namely raising awareness. We believe we must interlink existing databases and inventories and put more emphasis on data collection. International institutions should seek to support the development and availability of national and local inventories as an indispensable tool to protect and preserve cultural heritage. Regarding good practices and lessons learned for strengthening the international and regional instruments, we must maintain cooperation with a multitude of actors. The UN is a crucial forum for fostering collaboration and the exchange of information between local, regional, and multilateral institutions, as well as private, academic, and governmental actors. We must put more emphasis on soft power tools to conflict prevention and better integrate issues like cultural heritage in our approach. We should seek to enhance the institutional capacities of states and local communities, including throughout supporting the development of legislation, administrative rules, and dedicated crisis management plans, as well as digital platforms for cultural heritage. Destruction of heritage is often driven by faith and ethnic-based persecution and has directly contributed to unfolding humanitarian crises, displacement and forced migration, the violation of religious and cultural rights, and to undermining human dignity. This renders communities vulnerable as they are deprived of an important part of their identity and the relationship to their past. Extremist groups and other conflict parties can easily spread their influence in areas where identities and social cohesion have been weakened and division in communities been reinforced. Establishing cultural heritage protection is a key element in the maintenance of international peace and security, including through its combat against terrorism financing. In conflict zones, destruction and illicit trafficking of cultural heritage is on the rise. It is important to physically protect cultural heritage in crisis areas and to take measures against illicit trade in compliance with international law. In summary, Hungary supports the objective of making the preservation and restoration of cultural heritage a priority area for peace support operations and to allocate sufficient resources to this end. Accordingly, in addition to our humanitarian aid activities, Hungary is implementing numerous heritage conservation projects within the framework of our international development cooperation, the so-called Hungary Helps program. In this vein, and in line with Security Council Resolution 2347, Hungary welcomes that the State Secretary General will also reflect upon the protection of cultural heritage in the upcoming new Agenda for Peace as a key element of conflict prevention. And I thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Hungary, and I give the floor to the representative of CETED.
Shukran, Rais. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Director would like to commend France and the UAE, as well as Italy and Cyprus, for convening this timely Arria Formula meeting. We would also like to thank the briefers for their insightful presentations today, which shed light on the very different and important dimensions encompassed by the protection of cultural heritage in armed conflict. CETED welcomes the continued and revitalized engagement on the issue showcased by the discussions today. We're also particularly pleased to see renewed emphasis on the terrorist dimension of the phenomenon, which CETED continues to closely analyze and raise awareness of as part of its engagement with member states on behalf of the Counterterrorism Committee. The Security Council has condemned on numerous occasions the wanton and unlawful destruction of cultural heritage in armed conflict, including by terrorist groups. As we heard today, in certain contexts, the destruction of cultural heritage in armed conflict, including when committed by terrorist groups, has been recognized to be part of a deliberate strategy to deny historical roots and cultural diversity. In different resolutions, the Council has also drawn attention to the way in which the traffic in cultural property can be exploited by terrorist groups as a means to generate revenue, support recruitment efforts, and strengthen organizational capacity. Resolution 2347 of 2017 was a critical step in giving further recognition to the linkages between terrorism and the destruction and illicit trade of cultural property, and to the role that cultural heritage protection can play towards the maintenance of international peace and security. More recently, the call made by the Council in Resolution 2347 for greater international cooperation on the issue was reiterated in CETED's mandate. In Resolution 2617 of 2021, the Security Council recognized that CETED is uniquely positioned to raise awareness of the importance of member states' cooperation in relation to the investigation, prosecution, seizure, confiscation, as well as the return and restitution of illicitly traded cultural property, and in line with relevant legal frameworks. Pursuant to this resolution and building on CETED's work on emerging issues, trends, and developments, CETED has been further mainstreaming the issue in its engagement with member states on behalf of the Counterterrorism Committee, and in the context of its work with relevant partners, including UNESCO, the Financial Action Task Force, as well as academia and civil society. As part of this engagement, in September 2022, CETED was pleased to organize, in close collaboration with UNESCO and the Permanent Mission of Italy to the UN, a virtual roundtable discussion on the traffic and illicit trade of cultural property for terrorist purposes, which brought together experts from civil society and academia to elaborate on the current scope, scale, and defining trends of the phenomenon. Distinguished delegates, CETED is further committed to promoting meaningful accountability in the space and ensure that terrorist acts and related violations of international humanitarian law are duly investigated and prosecuted. In this regard, CETED is pleased to closely work with key partners in the space, including UNESCO and the International Association of Prosecutors, in mapping and enhancing criminal justice responses of member states to the destruction, looting, and illicit trafficking of cultural property and their linkages with terrorism. In doing so, CETED trusts that it will be able to count on the commitment and strength of resolve underscored by many of you today, and join efforts in strengthening international cooperation to effectively prevent, counter, and advance meaningful accountability for the destruction and illicit trafficking of cultural property for terrorist purposes. I thank you.
I thank the representative of CETED, and we have now heard from the last speaker on our speakers list. We clearly heard that cultural heritage can represent a strong link between civilians and their past while having the power to unite communities. We also heard that the destruction of cultural heritage can fuel tensions and hatred between communities and can leave little hope for reconciliation in times of conflict, resolutions, and peace building. Today's interventions and recommendations have highlighted specific ways of supporting efforts to protect cultural heritage, and we've taken good note of those, and we thank you for them. And on behalf of the co-hosts, I'd like to thank all participants in today's meeting, including our briefers. And with that, our meeting is concluded. Thank you.